This is Angela Taylor from the Lewy Body Dementia Association, and we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. I will be your moderator for the event, and as you see, we have a few housekeeping items on screen. Just want to confirm we are recording today's event, so that we can post it on our YouTube page. We have all of you muted as attendees so that everybody can hear Dr. Irwin's presentation. As the presentation goes over the next half an hour or so, you'll have an opportunity to think of questions that you might want to submit. There's a button on your screen called Q&A. We want you to click that and submit your questions to us throughout the event. And after the presentation is over, we'll be able to take as many questions as the time allows. So let me first introduce our guest. Today's guest is Dr. David Irwin, and he's going to be presenting how to utilize the LBDA Research Centers of Excellence program. Dr. Irwin is an assistant professor with the Cognitive Division of the Department of Neurology at the Penn FTD Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a cognitive neurologist who evaluates and treats patients with a range of neurodegenerative conditions, and he has a specific interest in dementia with Lewy bodies. He has an active translational research program and is co-investigator in Penn's Udall Center, investigating clinical and pathological facets of DLB. And Dr. Irwin is involved in several areas of patient outreach and education. He's a visiting lecturer at a local support group for both the Alzheimer's Association and the Association for Frontotemporal Dementias. He's also a member of our Scientific Advisory Council, leads the Penn site for the DLB Consortium, and he's also a co-investigator at the LBDA Research Center of Excellence at Penn. So we'll start our Dr. Irwin's presentation in a minute, and that's going to be followed by the question and answer period, as I suggested. So again, please send us your questions as they come up using the Q&A button. At this point, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Irwin as our guest. And Dr. Irwin, I will turn the screen sharing over to you.
Okay, thank you, Angela. And thanks so much for the wonderful introduction and the invitation to come to participate today. This is really a great honor, and I hope to help give some useful information to our listeners and to those who access the video in the future about the LBDA Research Center of Excellence program and about how to access care for individuals with LBD. So the outline of what we'll be talking about, and we'll start talking about the LBDA Research Center of Excellence program, what the goals are for the program, what we've accomplished so far, and the structure of what's available for patients to utilize, to visit and get clinical care at these individual centers. And then the second part of the talk will be about discussing aspects of clinical care and research and understanding the distinction between clinical trials and therapeutic trials and the different types and other types of clinical research. And this can be confusing when your physician has two different roles where they're seeing you in the clinical realm and then maybe seeing you in a research setting. So being able to hopefully give you some good insight into some of the key issues to be aware of as a family member or a caregiver or as a patient participating in these types of research activities. So to start, to introduce the LBDA RCOE program, this is really a wonderful effort by the LBDA to put together 25 centers across the U.S. that specialize in Lewy body disease and have a large clinical experience with the disease. And this was established just about a year ago in 2017, and this was through a peer review and chosen by committee. And there's four main goals of the Research Centers of Excellence. Those include increasing access to high-quality clinical care for patients with LBD and increasing the knowledge of LBD among medical and other healthcare professionals. So these two goals are really centered on maximizing the current standard of care for LBD disorders and helping patients and families access high-quality care from experienced clinicians. And as we'll discuss, one of the challenges of LBD is that oftentimes the multiple different types of symptoms that are involved require different physicians and healthcare providers with different backgrounds. And these centers of excellence, one of the unifying theme of them is that all have a strong interest in LBD, have a strong experience with this, and also have a lot of resources that are available to patients and families to access. So those two goals are really centered on clinical care and improving patient care right now. And then the other two goals are focused on research and how we can advance the care of Lewy body disease in the future moving forward. One of this is by establishing a clinical trials ready network of LBD centers, and we'll talk about how making a network of individual centers that see LBD patients is really important to help accelerate clinical trials. We want to see more clinical trials in LBD, and we like to see higher quality clinical trials that have a high likelihood of success. And by having, the last goal of creating an infrastructure or resources available to advance LBD research towards that goal of getting new symptomatic therapies and disease-modifying therapies, things that target the biology of the disease, we hope that this infrastructure that's built across all of our centers will really help accelerate that. And we'll talk about the distinction between different types of therapies, things that target symptoms versus things that target the biology of Lewy body disorders. Many individuals who are watching this or listening in have unfortunately experienced the difficulties of a Lewy body diagnosis. It's the challenges of this diagnosis often require several years to be established. Our definitions of the disease in its current form require a change over time or a progression in cognitive and motor symptoms, which can be difficult to detect in the very earliest stages of the disease. This has been studied systematically by several members of the RCOE network have shown that it could take up to 10 different patient visits on average to get a formal diagnosis of LBD. And this would require different specialists, primary care physicians, and different types of neurologists before getting an accurate diagnosis. And this is despite LBD being a common cause of dementia. In most large-scale population-based autopsy studies, meaning looking at all individuals within a given population, which is really very relevant to the general care. And most individuals in this country, we find that Lewy bodies in the brain or Lewy body disease is really a very common finding of dementia. So as clinicians, as physicians, as healthcare professionals, we need to do a better job of diagnosing LBD quickly and accurately, because we know that that delay in diagnosis can increase caregiver and patient stress and morbidity. The sooner that supportive care and symptomatic therapies are implemented, the better healthcare outcomes are and the better outcomes there are for patients and families. So that's why one of the main goals of the RCOE network is to increase the access to quality clinical care with clinicians and centers that have a strong experience in LBD. The other part of this goal is that LBD is a multisystematic disease. It requires coordination among healthcare professionals of all different backgrounds, including primary care physicians, neurologists, physical therapists, speech therapists, individuals who can trained in all the different aspects of symptoms of LBD. And we define LBD by the presence of abnormal protein called alpha-synuclein in brain cells, as we see here. And dementia or cognitive impairment is a central part of that disorder, but it's only one facet of LBD. And it's an important one, but we also know that there are many other what we call neuropsychiatric symptoms. These are changes in mood and behavior, having visual hallucinations or seeing things that aren't there, having delusions or false beliefs about events, depression, anxiety, changes in attention and alertness, motor changes that are similar to Parkinson's disease, but not always and could be different, agitation, and then what we call autonomic instability, problems with maintaining blood pressure and passing out or feeling lightheaded, feelings of constipation. And then the characteristic sleep disorder that is common in many patients with LBD called REM, sleep behavior disorder, which is characterized by acting out dreams, and that can be present for years before some of these other features. And we know that LBD is very heterogeneous, meaning not every LBD patient is the same. Some patients may have some of these features, but not all of them, or have different types of cognitive impairment of dementia compared to others. And we're just starting to understand how the differences in symptoms that we see in an individual patient relate to differences that are happening under the microscope in the patient's brain. And ultimately, that's what we want to treat and stop. So because this is such a complex multi-system disorder, it really does involve coordinated care among healthcare professionals. And the RCOE program is really focused on mobilizing this network and mobilizing these centers that have a team of people to address all these different aspects of LBD care. Another goal is to inform other individuals or healthcare professionals outside of neurologists about the features of LBD. Primary care doctors are on the forefront of the diagnosis of LBD. Most individuals go to their primary care doctor with their earliest complaints. And primary care doctors are excellent, and they're faced with many different health problems, a range of different body systems, not only just the brain. So the more that as the specialists who see Lewy body patients often can teach them and teach other healthcare professionals, such as those in the emergency room setting, about these specific features of LBD, we can help increase the efficiency of referring patients to a neurologist to get a formal diagnosis and an accurate, rapid diagnosis. And you may be aware of some of the difficulties with LBD and specific medications, for example, neuroleptics. And by helping inform other healthcare professionals about these important aspects of LBD care and avoiding these specific medicines, that helps reduce morbidity. Many patients and families report frustration with going to an emergency room setting and having to educate the healthcare professionals there about certain medications to avoid. And it's not that emergency room physicians and nurses aren't excellent, it's just that this is a very specific aspects of the disease, and they're trained to cover a range of different things from the heart to the lungs, and we need to help disseminate this information. And the RCOE program uses each center to help promote education, and that will improve symptom management of LBD by all healthcare providers. So in the research realm, or how we work towards getting better treatments, we would hope to improve access for patients who are seeking therapeutic trials. Many individuals would like to participate in a clinical trial. These are trials that may be testing a potential benefit of a therapy, and it may be difficult to find access to them. And this would be by accessing the LBDA and locating the centers of excellence, you'd be able to find a center in your area and a listing of specific trials to participate in. We'd also like to demonstrate to industry to invest in LBD as a therapeutic development by demonstrating that it's feasible to conduct a clinical trial. The most clinical trials in the realm of cognitive impairment have been with Alzheimer's disease. And by demonstrating that despite DLB being a unique disease or having different features, we can study this. It is feasible to conduct a clinical trial and to succeed. And we want to open that dialogue with industry to help them pay attention and focus on therapies that could help LBD. And we'd like to, as we communicate with industry, to also share with them our experiences with LBD patients to help them when they design their clinical trials to help improve their likelihood of succeeding. So, and by having referral centers that have experience with LBD, we make sure that the diagnosis is accurate, so that clinical trials that are focused on LBD have patients with LBD. One of the challenges of dementia, age-associated dementias, is that diagnosis is ultimately unknown without looking at the brain under the microscope, which we can't do. So making sure that patients, sometimes clinically, we could say a patient has LBD as a physician, and we may not be as accurate as to what's under the microscope. So there has been shown that the more experience a clinical center has with LBD, the more accurate they are in predicting actual LBD disease. So all of this will help stimulate and increase the quality of clinical trials. And then this infrastructure of all of our different centers together, we hope that we can combine our efforts. I'll discuss briefly some of the take-home messages of our recent meeting. And getting every center together in one room really facilitates the exchange of ideas and collaborations for research to help accelerate discovery in LBD. And we're also interested in discussing with industry ways to make collection of samples in clinical trials available to all research. So if a clinical trial is focused on a specific endpoint, we can also learn other things from trials so that we maximize every patient who participates in a clinical trial, what we can learn about the disease and ultimately towards a treatment. This is a map showing the LBD centers across the U.S. You could see that we cover from east to west, north to south, where the 25 centers are located. This is a highlight briefly of the Penn Center that I'm a part of, and my colleagues Andrew Sidoroff at the Penn Movement Disorder Center and John Duda at the Pennsylvania VA in Philadelphia. We work together, and one of the unique aspects that I was talking about LBD is that sometimes patients have more motor features. It could show up to see either Andrew or John, or I'm a cognitive neurologist, so I see patients with cognitive issues, and many patients with DLB could show up into my clinic. And to have the best care to address all of these features, really all of us working together. And Andrew and I will be having a monthly clinic now where we see the same patients together and in concert with physical therapists and other allied health professionals to give comprehensive care. So this is an overview, and many centers have very similar arrangements where we have both cognitive neurologists and motor neurologists working together. So in December of last year, we had our first meeting. This was organized by 4 work groups that address these central issues to our goals of the RCOE program. These include a clinical care and professional education group, a community education and support group, a clinical trial design and optimization work group, and an industry engagement work group. And what we did was go through each of these aspects of LBD care and itemize what is the state of the science now and where are we at and what are our goals to improve in these areas. A brief survey of the experience, we see a large number of patients with both DLB and PDD, or Parkinson's disease with dementia, which are considered under the umbrella of Lewy body disorders. So it's an experienced group with a high volume of patients, which is important. Most sites were active at least 5 clinical trials, and almost all of them were at least 2. So these are centers that have resources that are able to conduct these trials to improve care in Lewy body disease. The clinical care and professional education work group identified several milestones in management of Lewy body disease, things that are important for us to convey to patients and to help guide patients and families through as part of the disease progression. And it has been studied systematically that often caregivers of patients with Lewy body disease can be overwhelmed and underutilize the community resources that are available. And that's one of the goals, is to try to help facilitate and help inform caregivers on how to access these resources. It can be very difficult to locate and access these types of resources. So having an active social work program as part of the visit could be very helpful. And again, trying to increase awareness of LBD to other healthcare professionals. And one of the goals is to develop a toolkit for primary care physicians and others who may be the front lines of seeing LBD to help start the diagnostic workup and to get them to a neurologist sooner than later. And then also a goal is to encourage LBD education events at each site. This way that helps us inform patients and family about the disease, helps patients and families network with other support resources in the community, and also helps us educate local healthcare professionals. And we had at Penn recently, this past May, sponsored by the LBDA, a event just for that, which was successful and covered a range of topics about LBD care that was valuable to patients and families, and also healthcare providers of all different disciplines. And we have videos of those presentations that will be available on the LBDA website, so that can be watched at any time. And this is helping contribute to these goals of disseminating information to the healthcare community and to patients and families. The community education work group, focusing on how to improve caregiver support groups based on feedbacks from caregivers themselves. We want to know from patients and families what works and what doesn't. Some of the items that were highlighted were targeting caregivers at early stage patients. These are individuals who had the strongest interest into a support group. It was important that trained facilitators were a part of this, and we identified different sources of education that each site uses, and this includes the LBDA produced materials and the NIH, or National Institutes of Health. We also identified that mixes between in-person support groups and video conference support groups were also very effective. So we want to continue an active engagement with patients and families to help us design and implement the most effective ways of providing support and education. The clinical trial design and optimization work group, I co-chaired this group, and we talked about ways that we could help improve clinical trials. And one, again, is to engage with caregivers to understand what are the biggest barriers to care and how can we target these for clinical trials. We want to try to develop clinical outcome measures that would work for a clinical trial. The majority of scales that are used for clinical trials are designed in Alzheimer's patients, which may not capture these unique features of LBD, and that's what we want to start to design, and having all of us together is very helpful for that, and we're working on how we can start to make tools that will make clinical trials more accurate to the features that LBD patients experience, and then try to facilitate academic and industry partnerships, how we could work together to learn about the disease to work towards the goal of a trial. I will briefly just mention biomarkers is a term we use as a test, and this is something that can be used in a trial to help tell whether or not the agent that's being tested is working. So for example, blood pressure reading is a biomarker for vascular health, and if your blood pressure is high, you can give a drug and track that the blood pressure goes low, and that is essentially what we're looking for in Lewy body disease, is things that we can measure either in blood or with imaging or with spinal fluid, that we can measure response to a treatment. And we went through in detail ways that we can use this, one for diagnosis and other for prognosis, or tracking disease progression and target engagement, which just means is a therapy affecting its goal. So for the example, blood pressure as a medicine dropping blood pressure, in this case, would we be altering the formation of Lewy bodies, for example. So this was helpful to classify how we would use these tests as we learn more about how these tests are developed in the research realm. And then finally, in the industry engagement work group, we identified different goals. One is to be a central resource, having this network that would facilitate implementation of clinical trials and the communication with industry, including expert panels where we can advise industry sponsors and help share our experiences on the clinical side with their expertise on the drug development and the conducting of a clinical trial to help make trials as powerful as we can. So that is the end of the introduction to the LBDA Research Center of Excellence. I'll go briefly through some key aspects of research now to help hopefully disambiguate some of the aspects of research for patients. So research is any time a study is done to answer a question that's outside of clinical care. And clinical research is a study when people participate either as a healthy volunteer or as a patient. So it's a study of people. And scientists do research when they're not sure what will work best to help people with an illness. So to get the drugs that we're familiar with and are FDA approved, there has to be tests that are done to show objectively that it is improving healthcare. And that's why these trials are conducted. Other terms that you may hear are a clinical trial, a protocol, a study, experiment. These all relate to different clinical research. And the FDA.gov website has a wonderful resource for more information about different aspects of clinical research. There's different types of research studies. One is something called observational research. These don't involve an intervention or a medicine or a therapeutic. They're collecting data. This could be one visit where you would go in and get data collected, either cognitive testing, blood or spinal fluid, imaging, genetic testing, collecting information on one visit, or it could be longitudinal, a natural history study to show changes over time. These studies are critical for us to really understand the ways that we can make clinical trials succeed in Lewy body disease. These help us identify new biomarkers or tests that we can do to accurately track how a medicine is working and help us know how to design these trials in the best way we can so we succeed. So these are very important studies, but there is no intervention involved. I want to highlight briefly many of the Lewy Body Association Center of Excellence members have ongoing large-scale studies that are observational. This is through Jim Leveren's at Cleveland Clinic, has a consortium of 9 different centers, all of which are part of the LBDA RCOE network, where we're working together. We're sharing our data. We're collecting data in the same way so that we can all learn a lot more and accelerate discoveries rather than each university doing slightly different tests. So this is a very powerful approach, and this is really critical to us making clinical trials in LBD. This is at Columbia University. This is a study by Karen Marder and Lawrence Honig. They're looking at blood and cognitive changes in Lewy body disease, and they're looking at the brains of patients with Lewy body disease to make biomarkers, a new test based on changes they see in the brain. So this is another ongoing study, and then the Mayo Clinic is using different types of imaging to look at Lewy body type pathologies or different changes in the brains of Lewy body patients to figure out what are the best imaging ways to look at the disease and track the disease for a clinical trial. And then at University of Michigan, there's a similar trial looking at different forms of specific type of molecular imaging. And all of these are helping improve our diagnosis and ultimately therapy for Lewy body disease. The next type of research study is something called a therapeutic trial. These have many different forms. We think most commonly about a medicine or an oral agent that you could take, but these also could be an injectable agent, or they could be non-pharmacologic, meaning there's no medicine, something like a behavioral intervention with a structured daily activity regimen of exercise and cognitive stimulation and physical therapy, for example. That could be a clinical trial. It doesn't have to always be a medicine. And sometimes it could be a device, something non-invasive that could change biology with Lewy body disease. So they come in all different types. Another way to classify this is what is being targeted by the trial. We're all very enthusiastic in the ultimate goal of getting a disease-modifying therapy, meaning something that targets the Lewy bodies in the brain that cause the disease. So these target the biology of the disease. Equally important is symptomatic therapies. These are things that would help target the symptoms that patients experience, such as cognitive impairment or feeling dizzy when standing up or having active sleep at night. They may not stop the Lewy bodies from forming, but these could help make symptoms reduced and help improve independence and patient functionality. So these are very important and are equally being studied. And these can form, again, in different ways of looking at behavior strategy interventions, different psychiatric medicines, and different devices, ways to potentially stimulate the brain non-invasively. This is a schematic just showing that different clinical trials have different goals and different designs, and the road from a drug being accepted by the FDA has to go through several different phases of a clinical trial. So it's important, if you were to participate in a clinical trial, to understand what phase the trial is and what the goals of the trial are. So in the preclinical phase, this is in the lab where an animal or cell model or both, meaning some type of model of human disease, shows that a compound or an intervention has a biological effect. And then the phase 1 would be a short term, usually on the order of weeks to days, involving small number of patients or healthy individuals to demonstrate human safety would be the goal. And then in phase 2, these are expanded safety. These could be a little bit longer and involve a larger number of individuals. The goal of these is still safety. There could be recording of outcomes for a benefit, but the goal is still to demonstrate safety. And what we call the pivotal clinical trials, or the phase 3, these are the trials that are designed to show a clinical benefit and ultimately go towards the FDA for an approval. And these require often thousands of patients from across different centers, and that's why the LBDA RCOE program is aimed at having this network where recruitment for an LBD phase 3 trial would be feasible because of the large volume of patients that all the centers collectively see. And the good news about this pathway is you can see this is a time, there's a long time delay between all of these detailed studies that need to be done to make sure that medicines are effective and safe. There is new designation by the FDA for the National Alzheimer's Project Act to help facilitate this and reduce the administrative burden so that we can accelerate drug development. If you were to participate or think about participating in a clinical trial, there are several aspects of the trial to be aware of and to ask your physician about. One important aspect is that many therapeutic trials are placebo-controlled and blinded. That means that some patients who participate would not get a study drug. They would get something called a placebo, and that's important to help show that a medicine is effective. And blinded means that both the patient and your physician and everyone in the study may not know what an individual is getting, and that's to make sure that we know that it's working. Most studies are maximize the number of patients who have the active study drug and have certain checkpoints to make sure that if there is a benefit that's clear, that the trial can be stopped and the drug can be given to everyone as soon as possible. There's often a screening visit to determine eligibility. This is for patient safety, so this is important to make sure. You may want to participate in a clinical trial, and your physician may say that you can't, and that could be because of a medical comorbidity that may be unsafe. So it's important to talk with your doctor about that. Some clinical trials a patient may not directly benefit from. These would be the observational research, and these are extremely important for science and for advancing our clinical care. And it could be valuable to participate to some individuals, but it's important to know exactly what is the potential for benefit for an individual before taking part in a clinical trial. And then it's very important to follow closely with your physician. Being a part of a clinical trial often requires additional patient visits outside of your standard care. And many times you may have to report a change in medicines that you're given. For example, an antibiotic might have a potential reaction, so it's important to tell your study doctor everything that you're being prescribed or any changes in your symptoms to make sure that there's not a safety event. And this is all done for safety and make sure that the trials are done correctly. And clinicaltrials.gov, again, has a wonderful resource for patients and families to learn all about aspects of clinical trials. It's good to have a list of questions when you're talking with your doctor, and I won't go through all of these out of time. I want to make sure that we have time to talk and have an open dialogue, but the LBDA website and the NIH have great resources and lists of potential questions of things to understand exactly what is being conducted and why and what to expect. And these have specific aspects for all types of research, and then in particular clinical trials where a therapeutic is given. How can you find clinical trials or learn more about it? Your physician is always a good resource. Clinicaltrials.gov has a registry of all clinical trials being conducted in the U.S. and their status, so that's another good resource. And the LBDA on their website has a wonderful listing of all active LBD specific clinical trials and how to find more information. And then the Parkinson's Disease Biomarker Program is a great resource, and we'll make these slides available so you can have access to these. ALS Forum is a great news outlet for all. This is a wonderful resource that helps take cutting-edge science and make it accessible to everyone. So there's summaries of different articles and different trials are being conducted, summaries of different scientific meetings and the major findings that are presented at this meeting. So that's a great resource as well. And then both Alzheimer's Association and Michael J. Fox Foundation have different trial match programs where you can put in information about your clinical diagnosis, and they can help you locate trials in your area. The LBDA resources are outstanding. Strongly encourage you to go to their website. There's wonderful resources on education, all about the disease pathogenesis, symptoms, and treatment. There's a white papers publication that goes through all the state of the science of Lewy body disease, what we know and what people are working on. Support, how to access the RCOE centers, support groups, caregiver information, and research, clinical trials, and listing of clinical trials. And then finally, events like webinars such as this, talks, fundraisers, other activities to help network with other people. Your physician is a wonderful resource, and what's another great resource is other caregivers who have day-to-day experience with all the aspects of LBD, and reaching out to other people can be a very valuable resource, and LBDA really helps facilitate all of that. So I will conclude with this, and I look forward to opening discussion to everyone. So thank you for participating today.
Okay, Dr. Irwin, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and move us through a number of questions that we've received while you were speaking. But I'm going to open up with a question of my own to get the ball rolling. Can you help our listeners understand what makes you talked about successful trials. What makes a clinical trial considered successful?
Sure, that's a great question. It depends on, in part, what phase or what the goals of the trial are. Some of the early phase trials, or the beginnings of testing an intervention or compound in a disease, are focused on safety. So making sure that safety goals are met, and these are often generated, these goals, from experience in the animal models and sophisticated screening. So we know what to look for before starting the trial, and sometimes there is a risk of an unexpected safety issue. So these are all systematically collected. The later stage trials, or the phase 3s, usually have a clearly defined goal, and that would be a specific outcome measure where a target has been set before the study is conducted, and that target measure is usually a functional outcome. So for the FDA to approve a therapy for LBD, most likely this will require not only signs of changing the biology, but improving symptoms and improving a patient's function. And that can be hard to measure. So that's one of the things, as you know, we've been working on at the RCOE, is how to make those measurements of improvement in a patient's function reliable and robust to help make clinical trials. So to get your answer, that would be how one way that would be successful or deemed successful.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's take one of the questions from our attendees. And this, I think, is a very insightful question, because you talked about how right now we can't see the presence of Lewy bodies in the brain. And so we're making diagnoses based off of clinical symptoms. But how can you be sure that your clinical trials are effective if you're not 100% sure that all of the patients have Lewy body dementia?
Oh, that's a great question, and that's something in the clinical trials work group that we focused on was when we talked about biomarkers of these tests and how they could be implemented. And ultimately, we'd like to have biomarkers or tests that would help us when we see a patient clinically and we do the pencil and paper test and we do a neurologic exam and we think the patient has Lewy body disease, to make sure that it's highly likely that it's Lewy body biology, or the actual Lewy bodies in the brain that we can't see yet are in that patient. Because an analogous situation would be if your diagnosis is imprecise and you were doing a clinical trial, targeting, for example, lung disease, and you were targeting asthma or a reactive airway disease, an allergic response, but some of your patients had something else, an infection of the lung that had similar symptoms, your therapy may be affecting the asthma. In this case, we'd be saying Lewy body disease or the alpha-synuclein. But if some patients or a population of your patients that you're testing have the wrong disease, that could make your clinical trial have essentially a false negative, or a negative outcome when in reality the patients with the actual disease that of interest were benefiting. So that's a very strong area of research right now as to how to make our clinical evaluation when we see a patient match the microscopic disease of Lewy body disease as accurate as we can. And the new criteria that came out this past year are ongoing validation, but appear to be really improving that accuracy. And I think that's one of the strengths of the RCOE Center, is that these are experienced clinicians who know all about LBD, and when they have a higher likelihood of being accurate in what's happening microscopically.
Thank you. The next question is, and this is relevant because we're talking about clinical trials, are there medicines right now that can be used specific for LBD? And, you know, I'll tag on there, you know, what's FDA approved, what's not.
Sure. So I just want to repeat to make sure I understand. So what are the FDA approved therapies for LBD, and
Yes.
what's being tested?
Well, I think primarily, you know, what's FDA approved now, and what medications, are there medications that aren't FDA approved that are being used? And I think as we're talking about clinical trials and the whole aim of those is to get to FDA approval, I think this question about, well, what are we using now is relevant.
Sure. No, that's a great question. And the majority of what we're using is borrowing medicines from other diseases or from from psychiatric disorders to help the symptoms of LBD. We know that the medicines, the memory pills that affect acetylcholine, that's a neurotransmitter or a chemical in the brain that affects memory and Alzheimer's disease, have been studied in LBD and have shown to be beneficial. So those, at least a subset of those, they're all equivalent, and most would agree that they are, you know, equally equivalent in LBD, are used to help with the memory symptoms. And then the other symptoms, the range of different symptoms, we borrow medicines that are specific for example, blood pressure, if there's problems being dizzy standing up, or constipation, or for agitation. There is newly FDA-approved medicine for agitation and Parkinson's disease. It hasn't been tested specifically for DLB yet. This is a medicine that affects a certain brain chemical receptor. We often borrow medicines from psychiatry where patients may have agitation for other reasons, such as schizophrenia or other psychiatric disease, to help manage agitation. So, and many of these symptomatic therapies could be very effective, but exactly, we want to work towards DLB-specific FDA-approved medicines.
Wonderful, thank you. So here's a question that actually is, was on my mind earlier today, so I'm really glad to see it come up. How do you deal in clinical trials with things like fluctuating cognition, especially when you're talking about assessment to start a trial? If somebody's having an off day, how does that affect their being enrolled in a clinical trial?
Yes, and that's a really important point, and that was a focal discussion point at our meeting in December of last year. And one of the priorities of the clinical trial work group is this is a unique feature of LBD that we don't see in Alzheimer's disease. And I'm sure many people on this call are aware of experienced the dramatic differences in attention and concentration that can occur from hour to hour and day to day. And we talked about how an FDA approval for a therapy would likely require a functional outcome, something like a cognitive test score, for example, or a certain number of steps a patient's able to take, or a scale of independence at home. And these types of scales could be definitely affected by this very common phenomenon of cognitive fluctuations in LBD. So that's something that is of extreme importance for us to work on, is how to develop scales or procedures that would account for this, and how to incorporate that into a clinical trial.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question about research studies. Are there any investigations going on currently looking at hereditary risk as a component of the disease? This individual's father and brother, both of whom passed away, and their mother all had LBD, and so this individual's concerned for themselves, their children, and their grandchildren.
Sure, and there are, the majority of individuals with LBD have what we call sporadic disease, meaning that it's not caused by a single gene change, but there are hereditary forms of LBD, and there are hereditary risk factors that could contribute to one's risk of developing LBD, and there are hereditary forms of LBD as well. And this is an area of research to determine if some of the mechanisms that we know these genetic changes can influence one's risk of getting LBD could be targeted for therapeutic trials. So I know that this is a strong area of research, and these trials are coming soon. I'm not currently aware of a specific trial targeting, for example, glucocerebrosidase risk factor forms of LBD at this point. But I know that this is an area that many people are very interested in, and these trials are likely coming very soon. So clinicaltrials.gov and these other resources are also very important to help identify these trials.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question is how can my family member participate in a study or a trial if their physicians may have misdiagnosed their family member? If they've lived with a different diagnosis, can they be reevaluated at a study site to see if they qualify for the study?
Yeah, so this is this is an important issue, and that DLB in particular, if a clinician goes through the criteria of DLB carefully, it's very specific and likely that Lewy bodies are in the brain causing the disease. It's not as sensitive, meaning that there are individuals who have Lewy bodies in the brain, if we look under the microscope, that clinically we may not have detected. So it's not always that the physician is necessarily wrong, it's just we don't know all the best ways to detect Lewy bodies yet. That's why we're working on those biomarkers or tests to do that. So if there's a question of eligibility for a clinical trial, it's worth talking with your doctor about those. And, sometimes the difficulties of telling the difference between Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body disease can be challenging, and getting second opinion is not an unreasonable thing to do.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions about the RCOE program. How could they or might they work with large health systems, organizations like Kaiser Permanente, for example? Is there opportunity for some synergy there or collaboration?
Sure. I think that, as this infrastructure is now developed and is established, there's ways to engage in these different health organizations. I think particularly, in discussing the diagnostic toolkit, for example, that's one way that, potentially the LBDA Centers of Excellence could disseminate information about LBD diagnosis to general practitioners within one of these systems. So, I think that's definitely possible and likely.
Okay, thank you. So here's an interesting question. Given similar pathology of alpha-synucleinopathies, are research and clinical trial efforts being coordinated between Parkinson's organizations like the Michael J. Fox Foundation and LBDA's Research Centers of Excellence?
Sure, that is a great question. Microscopically, a neuropathologist looking at a brain can have a very difficult time saying whether an individual had Parkinson's disease with dementia or dementia DLB or dementia with Lewy bodies, because the Lewy bodies in the brain are in the same regions and the same amounts for the most part, and it can be hard to tell those two diseases apart based on pathology. Clinically, they are very different often. In patients with Parkinson's disease, cognitive impairment is a large part of the disease at different stages, but many individuals can go for a long period of time without developing cognitive impairment. So and what I'm getting at is that this differentiation of Parkinson's disease and dementia with Lewy bodies is difficult on a biological basis and on a clinical basis. And there are potentials, depending on the trial and what the goals are, that there could be trials that could use patients or could incorporate patients with Parkinson's with cognitive impairment or DLB. And I think that many RCOE centers are also engaged with active Parkinson's disease. I alluded to before that many of us have active engagement with our cognitive neurologists who would see, many DLB patients, and our movement disorder colleagues who could see DLB or Parkinson's disease. So the formal efforts between the different advocacy groups are still growing, but the expertise in those two areas is shared, and we're continuing to learn more about this potential overlap between the conditions that I think will help with clinical trials as well.
Thank you very much. So one of the questions really is not specific to clinical trials, but it's about brain autopsies and brain donations. And so I want to modify their question a little bit, because I think this may be, relevant for a lot of people. This individual, would have liked to have been able to donate their father's brain, but they did have an autopsy. So can you tell our attendees, whether brain autopsies, what types of studies include brain autopsies, and what do you look to learn from the brain? And if an individual has an autopsy report, apart from a clinical study, is that report of any value from a research perspective? Just from a routine clinical management, they saw, a general neurologist, for example, but also had a brain autopsy done after life. So,
sure.
Is there value to research in seeing autopsy reports on their own?
Yes. So my research is largely focused on autopsy tissue, looking at the signs of Lewy body disease in the brain and helping to work backwards and develop tests that help us get better at seeing a patient in clinic and saying that Lewy bodies are actually causing the symptoms that we're seeing. And brain donation is extremely valuable and a wonderful contribution to medicine to help facilitate us and our understanding of Lewy body disease. When we talk about biomarkers or tests to detect Lewy bodies in the brain, ultimately validation of those tests, for example, images of the brain or looking at spinal fluid, having brain tissue to correlate those findings with is really critical. In other disorders, for example, if you were doing a test of something involving the lung, it's very non-invasive to go and get a small piece of tissue to put on a microscope slide to validate your measurement. But in diseases of the brain, we can't do that. So brain donation is really critical for those. And for example, we've found that looking at spinal fluid measurements of proteins that are involved with Alzheimer's disease can tell us about the biology of Lewy body disease. So brain donation is extremely valuable for clinical research. Autopsy report can be valuable to confirm the presence of Lewy body disease, and for research so to get to the types of research that involve brain donation, these are usually the observational studies that I was highlighting, and they often involve detailed clinical assessments and these other tests so that we can then validate by looking at the brain under the microscope. Most centers will have, if you are a patient seen at a center, they will have an autopsy program where you can get an autopsy with an official clinical report that will be sent to family to get the final diagnosis. And that can be helpful after living through the disease to get the final diagnosis to confirm or find a different disease that caused the symptoms. And the autopsy report can be valuable for research too, depending on the research question. So I think it sounds like maybe an individual had was seen clinically, had an autopsy report that reported Lewy body disease, and wanted to know if that report would be valuable for research. Depending on the research question and the types of clinical data that were available, that potentially could be useful, and probably to talk to their physician about it.
Okay. All right. I think that's the important thing, is for them to have that conversation with their physician. Okay, wonderful. All right, we have time for one more question. And I'm going to expand this question as well. So the initial question is can the research centers help in making initial diagnoses of memory and cognitive loss? And my expanded question is how might the diagnostic process look differently at a research center of excellence versus, let's say, a general neurologist? You know, are the tests going to be different? Is it going to be more in-depth? Is it going to include more types of specialists?
Sure. You know, at each center there are several resources available, and including, you know, so there's many resources for support after a diagnosis is made. There also are, you know, potentially more resources for diagnosis as well. Access to some of the research tests can give us some additional insight into the biology of Lewy body disease that may not be available in standard clinical care. That being said, they are in the research realm where they haven't been fully validated, but being a part of those programs can be informative. The clinical expertise of the LBDA research centers is and that experience with knowing the types of questions to ask can be very valuable. You know, again, and even at centers of excellence, there can be a delay in making a diagnosis because of the need to show a change over time, and often the very earliest symptoms of LBD are hard to tell from, you know, other conditions that could be more benign, such as being sleep deprived or anxious, and it's only over time can those features of LBD emerge to be more accurate. So the Center of Excellence are really tuned to these things and be looking for them, and you know, they all have, you know, adequate follow-up to help follow over time to detect that change and to meet the criteria, then to be able to implement that supportive care as soon as possible. So I think, you know, to answer the question, there is a lot of resources there to help with diagnosis, and I think seeing a specialist as early as possible, if LBD is being considered as a diagnostic possibility, is something valuable.
Excellent. And I'll just highlight for everybody who's attending that these centers are all unique in their own way. There's no single pattern or of set of resources that every center must have. They are all highly qualified and have deep research experience. And so just want to share with everybody that this isn't there's uniqueness between all of the centers. It's not a built uniform model. So just wanted to make sure that we manage expectations appropriately there. All right, we are out of time. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Dr. Irwin, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, especially for all of your time and contributions to LBDA and our programs. We truly appreciate it. For everybody who is here, you can find Research Centers of Excellence on our website. It's lbda.org/RCOE, and that's RCOE for Research Centers of Excellence. Please let us know how we can provide you with support and information about the disease. Everything that we do, events like this, they are all supported by donations, and you can make donations to us through our website as well. So we will be sending out a link where you can share this webinar with your friends or families that you think might have an interest. You'll be receiving that in your inbox within the next day or so. You will also get a copy of the slides from today's presentation. So on behalf of LBDA, thank you again for your time, and we hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you.